the original Carmel. And I thought that it was especially interesting because Ribault's book is bad history. But it was a magnificent view of the Carmelites' view of themselves at that time as descendants of the spirit of Elijah, and as a kind of reflection of what John Baconthorpe, one of the earliest Carmelite theologians, said, that the original hermits on Mount Carmel formulated their rule based on what they thought Mary would have lived in her life as a young housewife in Nazareth. I thought that was a very significant connection, and something that I think we can pick up and run with. I have another link that I would like to address to Barbara for when she gets around to answering it. Specifically, Nicholas Doria and his counterattack, if you will, against Teresa's leadership and her insistence on women being able to run their own affairs. That was echoed later by Barbacari in her conflict with her cousin, Cardinal Berulle. And I was wondering, in those days, Barb herself was still a laywoman. She had not entered Carmel as yet. But I was wondering if perhaps she might serve as a good model for the Carmelite Third Order women in her activism to promote prayer, spirituality, and Carmelite ideals. So let's see. Who wants to go next? We'll have questions from you after all of this. Maybe.
Well, as far as Doria goes, the question has, right after I stopped talking, there was a question about how he had the authority to do what he did, how Berulle had the authority to do what he did. I think, I have read Doria's story also from another perspective. And from a Teresian perspective, Gracian was the victim of Doria because Doria resented the influence that Gracian had with the women. However, there's also another view of Gracian, which I didn't get into, but that is very clear in Teresa's letters, that Gracian was not a level-headed man. And he made a lot of bad decisions. Going into Seville may have been the wrong decision. But she describes him as a hothead, and she says he's hard to control. God love him. She calls him my son. She calls him father. She teases him all the time in her letters. And I think that part of the formula that we don't have time to really discuss is it's not just that Doria was a bad guy and wanted to take over, and the rest of them were innocents. Gracian was something of a scatterbrain. When I read his stuff, he's always whining. He really sounds like a man who lacks in judgment. And Maria de San Jose, of whom I'm a great admirer, but she was also a really tough cookie. And I can imagine that somebody like Maria de San Jose would have really gotten on the nerves of somebody like Doria. They were both two strong personalities. She had a wonderful education. She was raised in the palace of Luisa de la Cerda. She learned Latin. She learned French. I've seen letters that she wrote in French. She says that she had help from one of the nuns who was French, but she wrote in French. She had a really, really good background. She wrote poetry. She knew a lot, and she wasn't diplomatic the way Teresa was, because Teresa didn't have that kind of education. She also was politically shrewder. But we have really strong clashing personalities, and I think that when we tell these stories, it's hard to take the time to go into all of these different elements, but the story is much more complex than we might think. So my general comment, what I took away from the three, we all talked in some way about the rule, and I think that we can see that the rule is a constant, the Carmelite rule. But what does that mean? For Teresa, the rule was a guide to bring us closer to God, to give us a guide, a spiritual guide, rules to follow to bring us closer to a personal relationship with God. Whereas for some of the other characters in this story, the rule were rules that had to be followed, and the rules kind of got in the way of personal growth. That wasn't the issue. The issue was that we had rules and we had to follow them. Doria was a rule follower. Beryl and some of the others were rule followers, and people who followed the idea of suavidad, the nuns should be governed with suavidad, they didn't see the rule that way. So even when we talk about rules or the rule, we have to reflect on what that means. Thank you.
I have many more questions than I have answers, but I have a couple of comments to make, and that is, Ribot tells us something. Ever since the middle of the 19th century, we've tended to read history according to von Ranke, a German who said it's the exact words of the text and you follow them literally and that's it. The reason the Carmelites fell into trouble with Ribot's stuff, we didn't know how to read myth and symbol, which are another way of learning besides exact recounting of history. And Ribot is full of that. And Teresa just enjoyed the stories that were there. They're very rich and they hinted at stuff and she picked it up. Why she would be, maybe just by personality, so open to that. But we tend now not to be very open to that kind of learning. And you also know that perhaps we should all get on our knees here while we're talking about this history, because you know who suffered because the Carmelites had this inability to deal with that mythology. We put the Jesuits out of business, Carmelites did, in the 18th century. Had a strong hand in their being driven out of every place except Poland. And it should give us a lesson in that suavidad. That we really, if you're going to do history, you can't do it with a hatchet. You have to do it out of a friendship. For instance, in 1968 in Washington, D.C., a group of us got together and we had a congress on mendicant life, and then swore to each other that it would continue. Well, there hasn't been one since then. And that Congress pointed up this difficulty. When you study only your own order, you're studying in isolation. And the tendency is to blow things out of proportion as you read them. Whereas in dialogue with communities, and particularly I think we ought to start with the mendicants. Remember that Teresa never forsook the mendicancy of the order, and that changed. In fact, she'd have been a mendicant if she can get out. I mean, if you read the beginning of the Way of Perfection, Teresa's she's not so happy that she can't go out and preach and take care of those terrible Lutherans, so-called, up in France. I think, the poor Bollandists, the Bollandists were founded to tell the history of the saints, and there's only one left, one Jesuit Bollandist right now. And they're the people who produced the Acta Sanctorum, the volumes and volumes of the saints, all the manuscripts. It's penitential work from day one, and it's the kind of work you have to be willing to forego your own personality and just work at these texts. Well, if that disappears from the church, we're in deep trouble. If we don't know how to tell our history and how to do it in a way that Padre Fernando was suggesting, that we don't do it with an eye to create a Carmelite museum, but in fact, rather that we have a dialogue with history and know what questions to ask from what is going on in our own lives. I invoked Father Joachim this morning, and interestingly enough, I don't know how many of you have followed this, he could be a contrarian. And when everybody was praising Gracian, and Doria was the bad boy, whipped, Joachim took the other side, and he's written on that. Now, he may have been, reacting to what he thought was the overplay on Gracian, but in fact, what he has highlights issues that we weren't paying any attention to, and it's not whether or not one is right and the other is wrong, but is what was the story that took place at that time, and what wisdom is there for us. The other thing is that for Gracian, while we're beating up on Gracian, let me say a word on his behalf. If he did not save Teresa's letters, about a third of them would be gone. I mean, he saved Teresa's letters and guarded them. And I think Barbara has done this wonderful book on the letters of Teresa. Is it about a third that he did? Do you think it's quite that?
Yeah, there were. So at the convent in Valladolid, there's 40 letters.
Yes.
40 letters to Maria de San Jose that came through, that he originally rescued and sent to his sister.
Yes, yes. And so he was. Nobody's a complete villain, and nobody's a complete saint. Where none of us are that.
I thought I defended him so adamantly that I had to say yes, but Teresa even said,
yes,
he gets out of control.
Yes. I was wondering, after I heard Barbara's talk this morning, how much of a discussion there was about the constitutions and about the authority that those constitutions had from Teresa. Was that very much part of discussion?
So this was this was a big issue. Teresa wrote the constitutions early on in the foundation of the convent after San Jose, 1562. And then when they did the 1581 constitutions, so this is a year before she dies, and either she's too old or, she doesn't go to that. But it's Gracian's job to maintain those constitutions as she wants them, and she wrote to him. There's a letter, and she encourages him to keep the constitutions. So at that time, there's a lot of discussions of the constitutions, and they're writing letters back and forth, and the nuns are writing letters back and forth in support of the constitutions. And already Doria is trying to make changes. So the constitutions are an issue. It seems like they're an issue all the way through.
Yes, and I would like to say that I'm going to get into muddy waters here. Constitutions began for the Carmelites probably as early as 1247. That's the theory, that the very first general chapter, which was in 1247, would have had to have some kind of constitution, either rules that people had to follow. we have a tendency then to lock the constitutions in to make them like a decalogue, which even there we're supposed to interpret. And so I think we read constitutions always in movement, because they were meant to be a legislation that came out of the lived experience of for instance, when the Carmelites in the Middle Ages met every 3 years, they added constitutions. And that's been done in a different way, but the same kind of thing in a modern Carmelite life. But we need to develop a hermeneutics of constitutions and other documents of religious orders. That is, develop principles that we use of interpretation. And that if we don't interpret them, then there's a sense to take them on either side of a question to defend this side or that side. And I was going to say how glad I was that Leopold this morning took us into this area where he took the background in which Teresa arrives on the scene and is a woman of her times, and how much what happens in the world in some way, she became she who could have been at the fireplace cooking for the rest of her life, ended up being an extraordinary large figure in history. And one cannot, I think, dismiss Grace on that picture. Somehow or other, Teresa was open and had a large mind. And I think, I'm proposing this in the lecture I'm going to give at Notre Dame in about 3 weeks, that Teresa was an expert in eutropelia. Now, you all practice eutropelia, I hope. Eutropelia is Aristotle and then Thomas Aquinas. It's the virtue of the person in the community or in the family who makes things work and addresses the issue of the weariness of life. And if you live in a community and you've never been weary, then you haven't lived in a community. Or if you've been married and you haven't become weary, you haven't been married. That we know you in human life. And there are people with the gift. Eutropelia means, watch Teresa in this. I mean, she knows how to address issues, I think when to pull back and not too much pressure. And she knows how to talk about the good qualities of the women in her monasteries. She knows how to handle men besides. I mean, she lets them talk on and then does what she wants. That's so anyway. At that, I should shut up before I get and say things that I shouldn't say. Ooh. Watch this.
That's our ambush. My novice master used to be fond of telling us that there are two kinds of people in community life. There are the saints and there are the saint makers. And I would like to make just one more connection before we throw it open for your questions. During the establishment of the communities in France and elsewhere, I hope you may have noticed that someone like Berulle, who was deciding that he was going to make decisions for the community, and that he was lobbying that a certain person should be or should not be accepted, was acting like a patron. Okay? This is one of the things Teresa wanted to get away from. You found communities in poverty, quotation marks, dependent on just free will offerings rather than some wealthy or powerful person who's going to tamper later on. Now, we're having a little bit of time for you folks to ask questions. If your question has more than 10 words, I would ask you to come up here and use the microphone, just so we can get the recording proper. If it's a short question, just stay where you are, stand, and shout it out. On that subject of, no one is completely angelic or completely villainous, there's the statement, "I'm not a complete idiot, there are parts missing."
Okay, I have a question for Dr. Mujica. John and Teresa died, as far as I know, au carmes. Okay, it was their followers who petitioned Rome to separate the branches. And your talk, I might have missed something there, but the first reference I heard was the the disc house.
No, that's...
Okay.
Yeah, so... Yeah, so the order was divided before Teresa died. I think it was 1580. The first, Philip II issued a statement in Spain dividing the order. By the time she died, the order had been. Everybody understood that the order was divided, and that they could use their title Discalced Carmelites, and discalced was written with a capital D instead of Discalced was written with a capital D instead of with a lowercase D.
But there's an addition to that it was until 1593 that there was papal approval for them to be a separate order.
Right.
So
Okay. Yeah, those are two different things. So the first thing that happens is it happens in Spain. So with the king. But before she died, she knew that the order was discrete. That the Discalced Carmelites were a discrete order.
There was a kind of a staged separation.
Right. Exactly.
Within the Carmelite family while Teresa was alive. First of all, a separate Reformed province.
Why don't you take the right?
I wish I could remember the dates on this because they are significant, but the Reformed province, which included women's and men's houses, was conceded by Teresa and many other parties because there was a recognition that after so much bickering and hard feelings, two observances would have trouble living together. So it was a kind of a token separation. And then there was an independent congregation, thank you. And finally, the doings of Nicholas Doria, approved by the Pope, actually made a separate order. Okay? I think the 1593 was the final separation. Is that correct? Okay.
But out of all of that came a principle which we're still trying to work with. If you want to have a reformed religious community, where do you start? And it came out of this experience. Do you have reformed houses and ask people who want to be reformed to move into those houses, or do you start with a province, a collection of those? And the terrain reform is an example of using houses, that they start out, it's a reform of a province, but it starts out by the principle, I think, pretty sure, that you get a collection of people who will live the life according to a new vision, and then hope that will bring about, attract others and to live, and then eventually would affect the orders, I think. That's. Yes. Do you have anything, Father Fernando may have something on that. Do you have anything to add to that? No.
So there were individual houses. In Seville, there were individual houses. There were male houses and female houses that were discalced. Before all of the separation, but there were people who there were houses that accepted the reform before the official division.
One of the nice things about the terrain reform is that it was completely voluntary. Individuals and communities and eventually provinces voluntarily adopted the new constitutions because they saw primarily that the people living under the reform were so happy. Next question, please. Yes, Karen.
Did Teresa ever read, this is for Keith, did she read the, what do they call it, the, by Ribot, the
Rebought?
institutions of the first monks?
Yes, okay. Do you all hear the question? This is a really critical question. And then let me add some modern history to it.
Please say the question again.
Okay, the question is, did Teresa read Rebought, who is the person who wrote The Institution of the First Monks, a book that had a huge impact over the years? It was the primary book of spiritual reading among the Carmelites until the beginning of the 17th century, including, I think she did read it, at least she certainly heard it, because the rubrics call for that. I threw in this morning that I was convinced because of her addiction. She had several addictions. One of them was to reading. She tells us that. She just loves to read. And that with that book, that manuscript in the house at the Encarnacion, it would be a surprise, it would seem to me. And because she has this, I've collected all the places, and there are a lot of them, where she refers to the indications that she got them out of the Ribaut's text. And so my own conviction is, when you're eating, you eat. When you have reading at table, you learn how to not listen. I think it would be very difficult to pick up the kind of things that she picked up on, not necessarily literally taking them out of the text. Now, in modern times, there's room for repentance on both sides. The Discalced thought nothing ever happened before Teresa. And the O'Carms said that everything happened before Teresa, and she was just living out this, just to see the kind of thing. Carmelite, I was going to start this morning with this story. Well, maybe I did when Father Benedict and I got together in secret and vowed never to tell anybody that we were meeting secretly, that we should be with each other. So the dialogue, and I think those of us in the forum are happy that we've had an opportunity, a privilege of being part of showing, at least in North America, that we could talk to each other to great benefit. And if we didn't, we probably could soon reach extinction if we were all going off on our separate ways, not doing it. Anyway, I'm talking on in here. I'm going to, more questions?
She never mentions it in any of her writings, does she?
No, yeah. You hear Kieran's comment. She never mentions Rebought in her writings. I think, now I've made these collections, my reading, I took what I knew of Teresa, and then I took Rebought's manuscript and tried to locate as many places as seemed to me she extracted from and used her own language. But that's an approximate science. That's not the same as being able to take an exact quote. I think Teresa was too free-flowing to take exact quotes. I think she was a great storyteller. She's the great storyteller of mysticism and Carmelite mysticism. And that when she tells a story, she's not going to give you exact textual quotes. So I think it remains a mystery as to whether... Okay. Yes, that's another thing from Carmelite sermons, because we know that Rebought was read by the friars and would have been read by John of the Cross, because in 1507, Rebought was published in Latin and was available and was circulated with the formation in mind. And so she could have picked that up from the friars, who, I don't know whether they had the friars reading all of that or parts of that. But anyway, that's still a puzzle. It's there.
Yes, please.
Leopold, I was surprised a large number of Muslims in Spain. I knew there were Muslims, but I was surprised the way you mentioned it. There's a huge number of them, but they don't seem to have been as violent or the same type of Muslim that we're dealing with today? Do you know anything about that?
Yes, thank you. The question was concerning the large numbers of Muslims in Spain and their overall temperament. By Teresa's time, the number was much reduced, but it was still very substantial. Many of the Muslims in Spain were professionals. I think it was fairly well known that if you want a really good doctor, for example, a physician, the Muslims were among the best. And if you couldn't find a Muslim doctor, you'd go for a Jewish doctor. That's still true. Now, a lot of the people who were forced to get up and leave the country took many skills with them. And that was an overall weakening of the Spanish population. So with respect to Cardinal Jimenez, it was a dumb policy. There were fairly large numbers that were still there, some of whom converted, some of whom emigrated. You saw on my transparency this morning, I did not give a number. I had looked for one to find out approximately, what numbers of people we're talking about, but I was not able to find it. It's just that most of the books that I consulted said that there were very large numbers who simply got up and left. And by that time, you're correct, they were not terribly violent or belligerent. Most of the remaining Muslims, after this shrinking back of Muslim controlled territory over the 700 years, quite frankly, most of them realized that they were in a minority and that they better keep quiet, keep their heads down, not raise any kind of ruckus, because they had no power anymore to really hit back on an equal basis. I mean, it was...
Can I make an addition to that?
Please.
So in the last couple of years, there have been a lot of studies on this issue, and there was a new study that just came out called Isabel the Warrior Queen, and I can embellish a little bit on this because the situation was more complex than we thought. At this time, Ahmet the Terrible was moving from Turkey. He was attacking Bosnia. He was moving towards Europe. He was moving into Italy, and he actually captured. I mean, this was a terrible. Talk about violence. He was absolutely as violent as what we're seeing on television today. He would go into towns at in a single day. He murdered thousands and thousands of people. He beheaded something like 4,000 people at a time. He went into Constantinople, and then he was moving towards Italy, and he captured the city on the heel of the boot of Italy. Isabel was actually the brains, the political brains here, because at this time Ferdinand was having problems in Aragon. There were conflicts in Aragon. He went to Aragon. She was concerned because although the Muslims were greatly weakened in Granada, they had contacts in North Africa. And she was afraid that if Ahmet moved into Italy and then moved into the area around Egypt, that there would be a connection. Well, there were connections between the Andalusian Muslims and the Muslims in North Africa, and that they would receive Ahmet with open arms because what they wanted was to reconquer Spain. So for that reason, she thought it was absolutely essential at that time that the Spanish forces really place great importance on combating the Muslims. The Muslims didn't just fall down and die at that time. There were some pretty heated battles, and I recommend this book. Her name is Downey, is the last name of the author. But it was a complex situation, and it was a real political threat. She thought her country was in danger, and she thought that if the Muslims moved across the straits and into southern Spain, that they would have such tremendous numbers with the reinforcements that they would get from northern Africa, they could take back the territory that had been won. So in terms of the violence, in Spain, I have not seen indications that the Muslims were as brutal as what we see on television, but Ahmet was more brutal. He was absolutely horrible, and he was moving north first. He moved north. He conquered all that area that's now Bosnia, and then he started moving through Turkey and into Italy. And so this was a real threat. Everybody was frightened.
Are you talking about Lepanto now?
No, Lepanto was
No,
much
that was
later.
much different.
We are approaching the Cinderella midnight hour, so we have one more.
Relatedly, the question of positive influence from Islam on Teresa.
Come up, please.
We heard this morning of how there were conversos in Teresa's family. I have read, without confirmation, that there were Moriscos in John of the Cross's family. So we have this issue of descent, but I'm asking a question about influence on the mystical vision, because there was a vibrant mystical tradition in Islam during those 700 years. And even though it might not show up in footnotes in the writings of these two saints, it was in the air that they were breathing. And I'm wondering what any of you can say about that.
I can answer that. You want to answer it?
Barbara's going to answer that, but one thing is that for sure there was converso blood among in John of the Cross. John of the Cross's family, his paternal family, had the same difficulties as Teresa did with their Jewish blood. Now the interesting thing is his mother is an Alvarez. You know, that little bit of Islamic background to the people with AL. Go ahead, Barbara.
So there are a couple of studies of, and some really good ones, and if you're going to ask me for bibliography, I'm not going to be able to bring it all up. But the images that Teresa uses are very similar to images that we find in Islamic poetry, and very similar to Kabbalistic images. So there's a book by Catherine Switlicki in which she talks about the imagery in the writing of St. John of the Cross and Teresa, images such as the almond tree, even the butterfly, the moth. I was at a conference in which there were three parts. Somebody talked. It was about mysticism, and there was somebody talking about Islamic, somebody Jewish, and I was talking about Christian mysticism. And in the end, when we all got together, we realized that we had all said the exact same thing. And basically, the images that I had described, the turtle, the erizo. How do you say that? It's the, oh shoot, it's an animal that, no, hedgehog, yeah. So that moves in on itself, snails. All these images, you find them in lots and lots of mystical poetry. Whether she got them directly from Sufi influences, or I believe that you're right, that was just in the air, that that these were images that were used everywhere, and but they're certainly in her poetry and St. John's poetry, the Jewish images and Islamic images.
And I think that part of popular culture at the time passed on to people who lived in peace for the most part, with the Muslims and the Jews and the Christians. And very often nobody was pushing them to be opposed to each other. They shared their popular culture. And I can't prove that, but I have a suspicion that a lot of the popular culture would get to people like Teresa. And I don't know about John of the Cross, but certainly.
So there's a really good book by Barbara Fuchs about Islam in Spain. It's Fuchs is her last name, and what she shows is that even after the Moors left, all of these customs that the Moors had, the games, the Juego de Cañas, which is a kind of a quadrille horse game, chess, all of these ways of dressing, the food, all of this remained. But people didn't see it as Arabic. They saw it as Southern Spanish. And even when people from England came and they saw how exotic Spain was, it seemed very exotic to people from England, but they didn't associate with Arabic culture. They just saw it as exotic Spanish culture. So I recommend that book.
Thank you, Barbara. Thank you. Thank you, Barbara and Keith and Leopold. It's been a very good day to get the historical context for Teresa and insights on her work from that historical context. And I think actually if I just had one thing to add, I would say that reform of religious life, or as we say today, the renewal of our life, doesn't begin either with a house or with a province. It begins with individuals who determine to renew and deepen their life of discipleship to Jesus Christ and commitment, in our case, commitment to the rule and the vision of Carmel. So it's something, again, it began with Teresa. It didn't begin with San Jose. It didn't begin with the province. It began with Teresa and her vision, and we're grateful for that. Mass will begin in 15 minutes at 4:30. At Mass today, we will remember in a particular way James McCarthy, the brother of Sister Dawn Marie.